Hey, it's a Star Wars 7x7 bonus episode. Yes, we are still on hiatus, but I had a conversation that I could not resist sharing with you. It's with Doug Burton, who is the author of, among other things, The Heroine's Labyrinth. Punch it. Hey, Rebel Rouser. I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So, yes, I am still on hiatus. We're coming back in November, but I got to have a conversation with someone, and I just could not resist sharing it with you sooner rather than later. So, here is the official bio situation. Doug Burton is a novelist and storyteller whose works emphasize heroic women in fiction. Burton's multiple award-winning debut novel, Faraway Bird, brought Byzantine Empress Theodora to life through an intimate biographical account. Recently, Burton's short story, The Vaccine, won the 2024 Next Gen Short Story Awards for the Scary Story Paranormal category. Congratulations, Doug. Burton's newest book, The Heroine's Labyrinth, Archetypal Designs in Heroine-Led Fiction, is a writing craft book that proposes an original story structure sourced entirely from heroine-centric stories. Labyrinth model offers a groundbreaking alternative to the hero's journey. Burton currently lives in Austin, Texas with his wife and 2 boys. And so, yeah, I got to have a long conversation with him, and we talked a lot about not only this idea, the Heroine's Labyrinth, but how it applies to Star Wars, to A New Hope, but we also talked about other movies in the Star Wars realm as well. And like I said, I'm excited to share it with you. And so, yeah, didn't want to keep it stashed until November. We're dropping it right now. So here, without further ado, is my conversation with Doug Burton, author of, among other things, The Heroine's Labyrinth. Doug Burton, thank you so much for joining me on Star Wars 7x7. How are you today?
Excellent. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm very excited to be talking with you. This one we've been working on in the background for a couple of weeks now, and it's really exciting. So I want to jump right in, and I'm very pleased to see a Star Wars t-shirt and Star Wars stuff in the background. Oh yeah, and honestly, Empire Strikes Back is my absolute favorite. So, but tell me about you. Tell me about your origin story with Star Wars.
Yeah, so I'm, Gen X. We grew up on this, and it's funny because we had, our baby boomer fathers were usually pretty young, and they were excited, they were into this, and so I feel like it's always been a great multi-generational franchise, that we get to enjoy. So the first movie I ever saw was Star Wars. Now I guess you have to say saw with air quotes because I was like 18 months old. So I was born in 76. My dad took me into the theater and he said I actually was okay for the first half, and then I got a little fussy. But technically, Star Wars was the first film that I attended.
Wow.
Yeah. And I do have memories of seeing The Empire Strikes Back. I grew up in Chicago, and I remember seeing that movie and just being blown away by it. I remember shooting TIE fighters out the back windshield of my dad's car, and just being really into Star Wars. So, I'm a child of the 80s. So I followed George Lucas and the trilogy. I remember it being kind of something you didn't broadcast maybe in the 80s if you had some like nerd culture in you.
Yeah.
But by the time the 90s rolled around, I remember the special editions came out, and that just shot lightning back into enthusiasm for Star Wars. And by the time the prequels were coming out in 1999, Star Wars was kind of like mainstream cool. Like you could come out of the woodwork and tell everyone how much you loved it.
Right.
And then, of course, the prequels went through the 2000s, and now Star Wars has become really just a global iconic brand. So it's great for me because I love Star Wars.
Yeah, and now we're at the place where we can all talk about it, and it's so pervasive and part of the public consciousness that we never have to worry about, oh, is somebody gonna think I'm odd because I'm so into this now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's entire podcasts and YouTube channels that are entirely devoted to the topic, and it's amazing that the well never runs dry. There's so much to talk about and cover with Star Wars.
Oh, absolutely. And so I think it's pretty well common knowledge that George Lucas based his his storytelling on the works of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, but I don't think it's necessarily well known that there's a guy named Christopher Vogler who wrote a book called The Writer's Journey, and
Yes.
he essentially kind of codified the idea of the hero's journey into sort of a 12-step process. I'm wondering if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that, and also about where, like, you, in thinking about storytelling, may have found that lacking, so to speak.
Sure, sure. So first off, I am not anti-hero's journey. I very
Hmm.
much support the hero's journey. Um, uh, not from the standpoint as a writer that I see the archetypal designs of the hero's journey in so many stories, and I've learned so much about storytelling by educating myself on the hero's journey. It's truly a fascinating uh, monomyth.
Hmm.
So I heard of the hero's journey, I think in the late 80s. But I really came into contact with it living in Chicago. There was a Joseph Campbell Star Wars exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in
Mm.
Chicago.
Yeah.
And I went to it, and I'll never forget. I was like, man, a Star Wars exhibit at the museum. It just seemed so cool to me that this was being treated as like esoteric, academic knowledge. And I turned the corner, and there's this massive model of a Star Destroyer, like just huge, right in the middle of the room. And I was just like, whoa,
Hmm.
this is my museum. This is what I've been waiting for. And they had a book called Star Wars: The Magic of Myth in the gift shop. And it's
Mm.
written by Mary Henderson. And I grabbed it, and she was the first one that really took the hero's journey and blasted it into my understanding, because she was going over a lot of examples of the archetypal designs as found in Star Wars, as found in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And
Mm.
this was the focal point, because this was before the prequels came out.
Yeah.
Um, so suddenly I was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing that these archetypal designs are embedded in Star Wars, that they have such extra meaning that you can interpret it from a primal level as a child. Oh, when Darth Vader enters the Tantive 4, you're like, oh, this dude's scary. This is a bad dude. He didn't even say anything. He just walked into this war zone. You know, you can understand that on a primal level, and then as you get older, you can unpack it and eat. And that same image, the same scene, has all these other meanings, and then you could discover that the same archetypal designs are in Lord of the Rings or The Lion King or The Matrix and all these other epic stories. So that to me was the first time that I realized how much more a story could be.
Mm.
And then, of course, to your point, I bought Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey, and I began to study the hero's journey in earnest. And I had studied it for 20 years.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and so where I decided that there might be some limiting factors, I began to write my own book. So I've written short stories and everything. And finally, I was writing a historical fiction book about Byzantine Empress Theodora. She's a
Mm.
real character in history from the Byzantine Empire. And while writing it, suddenly the hero's journey, after 20 years of just believing in this and betting the farm that this was going to help me organize my story, it just didn't work. It did not
Mm.
match up whatsoever to some of her biographical details.
Mm.
So now, just so you understand, or your listeners understand how I'm looking at the hero's journey, I view it as a character arc, and I believe that it actually mirrors real life. And I say that with personal experience. I went through a hardship myself in the housing market crisis in 2008. And I remember I lost it. I lost my business. I lost my house. I was at a
Oof.
very low point. And I remember dusting off that old book from the museum, Star Wars: The Magic of Myth. And I remember reading Mary Henderson's analysis of what's called the belly of the beast, which is an archetypal design in the hero's journey. And reading it, it says the hero is disgraced. The hero fails, comes up short, and this will sometimes include dismemberment or a symbolic death. And but while reading her analysis, she's like, but the hero comes back from this. The hero returns, like Luke does in Return of the Jedi. And this had a profound effect on me, because it made me realize that the archetypal designs of the hero's journey mirror uh, actual personal development and psychological development in real life. So when the hero's journey wasn't working for my heroine while writing the book, I thought that there was a major flaw. How could she not have a growth arc and it doesn't fit the hero's journey? So that's when I started studying an alternative to the hero's journey, maybe one that is suited for female lead characters.
Hmm. Okay. So then you came up with not the heroine's journey, but the heroine's labyrinth. So
Right.
can you explain a bit, I guess at a high level for now,
Sure, sure.
about the heroine's labyrinth and a couple places where it differs from what we know of the hero's journey?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the heroine's labyrinth is an alternative to the hero's journey, like point blank. It's it's in the spirit of the hero's journey, and it's not something I made up. It's something I discovered in existing stories. I
Hmm.
started watching heroine-centric films. I started watching heroine-centric television shows, which are very long-form stories. I began reading all the classic literature that had a heroine as the lead character, comic books with heroines as leads, and it became this incredible labor of love. Because I realized there's so many heroines I really do like, and then by extension, heroines that I had not yet discovered that I ended up just being like, wow, these
Hmm.
stories are incredible. I began to love these stories as much as Star Wars and Star Trek and Indiana Jones, which I've always held, near and dear to my heart. And so I found 18 archetypal designs, 18 unique patterns that, when strung together, form a narrative arc comparable to the hero's journey. And
Okay.
I discovered these archetypal designs by studying heroine-centric stories. So that is why I named this arc after the heroine. That was through her stories that I learned so much about this alternative model. So Joseph Campbell's hero's journey prominently features a departure and a return. And the departure, in fact, is what Campbell names Act One. This is the overarching concept of the first act of your story. The hero will be acclimated into his native culture. Usually there is a claim on the hero's labor, but the hero leaves the native culture. The hero departs and sets out into a wilderness setting or a liminal space, desert, ocean, forest, space, something that's empty and vast. And then the story, there's several steps on the story, like the meeting of the wise mentor, the magical talisman, which for Luke Skywalker was Obi-Wan Kenobi and the lightsaber, the wise mentor and the magic talisman. And then there's a threshold guardian. There is a character in stories that prevent the heroes from this great departure or attempt to block the hero's departure. And in Star Wars, that has been assigned to Pigface and Walrus Man, who confront Luke in a hostile way. And this belligerent sentry character must be overcome by the hero. And then finally, the hero will have a supreme ordeal, slay a dragon, the villain archetype, which is called the distant dragon. The hero confronts the distant dragon in A New Hope. That is the Death Star. Um, like all terrible dragon archetypes, they can breathe fire. They have culture annihilating streams and abilities. For like the fire breathing dragon can destroy the city of Dale or an entire culture. And the Death Star has the green laser that destroys planets.
Hmm.
Then the hero returns. That is the key. The hero returns. So I noticed in a lot of heroine-centric stories, the heroine wasn't necessarily demonstrating this significant departure of the native culture and a significant return. A lot of heroine-centric stories, the heroine stayed in the native culture, and her conflict stemmed from problems within the native culture. So the
Hmm.
heroine's journey was an inward journey into her own culture. So instead of a departure and a return, the heroine's journey was inward. It was an immersion of the native culture. And in the end, Act Three, it was a rearrangement, or what I call a permutation of the native culture. The culture is changed in some way, hopefully for the better, in a small way or a large way. So that is the fundamental difference. It's not an outward departure and return. It is an inward immersion and then rearrangement of the native culture itself. So it's fundamentally and existentially different in terms of what the lead character is dealing with in terms of conflict.
Got it. Actually, it's amazing. It also like of all things made me think of economic development scenarios where when you
Huh.
talk about investing in developing countries and how investing in women and communities and female-led societies, the money actually stays there and helps the society bloom. Whereas if you're investing in men, sometimes the men are taking what they're learning, what they're earning, and they're actually leaving those societies. And it's almost a similar kind of idea where you're making the investment and helping the community bloom when you're investing in female-led businesses, for example.
Well, there's a lot to learn from both arcs. The hero, I believe, emulates what I believe the hero's journey emulates a hunter warrior arc,
Hmm.
which now I do not believe that the hunter warrior is exclusive to men. I want to be clear that neither model
Right.
is gender exclusive.
Hmm.
Both models have universal attributes. In fact, there's stories where female leads go on the hero's journey, and I uncovered numerous examples of men who follow the heroine's labyrinth. So there
Ah.
is in terms of storytelling, there's a structural heroine whose conflict is within the native culture. And then for the hero, there's a structural hero who departs and confronts a militant outsider who is seeking to subjugate or annihilate the native culture. You need both. Both are important. Um, but I do think that the heroine's labyrinth and the struggles that heroines model and solutions have been less appreciated or less understood. And hopefully, I can share my appreciation of the heroine's journey through the labyrinth in storytelling terms.
And so, speaking of that, in terms of storytelling, you're able to develop this idea, the heroine's labyrinth, and you're looking at stories in popular culture where that kind of helps you formulate the idea of it. But it sounds like, especially with Theodora, is it?
Empress
Um,
Theodora, yep.
Yes, that there are historical stories similar to the idea of Joseph Campbell looking at historical stories and developing this idea, that there were also historical stories for you as well of, real people and not just, stories in popular culture, but real people from long ago that also supported this idea. Is that right?
Yes. So, you think about it, it recontextualized my understanding of conflict from a general sense or a general umbrella to something more specific. Fate monster combat, which is featured in the hero's journey. Don't take that if that's not dismissed. That's traumatizing.
Mm,
Going up against a large, physically violent creature and then having to confront it yourself and overcoming it, that's traumatic. That's why these heroes, when they come back, when they do come back, they're not the same. They're not the same guy or girl. They have undergone some change, and that's where the PTSD can come from. Frodo in Lord of the Rings, he
hmm.
couldn't reintegrate at the Shire. The entire quest was out of love of the Shire and trying to protect it, but then he had trouble, reintegrating. So
Right.
that matters. But when I looked at heroines and I'm like, man, their own culture is the problem. They're up against gender roles, social norms, cultural expectations. There's these invisible or sometimes overt rules that the heroine is introduced in her story that you can do this, you cannot do this. This is what the culture expects. This is what we have planned for you. And I thought about it, and when you really start to unpack that conflict, that's also that's incredible. It generates incredible anxiety because if you have aspirations that are in conflict with the expectations of your native culture, this is going to create an incredible amount of stress. And I just don't think the hero's journey deals with that aspect the way that the
Hmm.
heroine's labyrinth puts it out in the forefront.
So let's talk about that in terms of Star Wars. And it's kind of
Sure.
interesting that, over the last, I'll say, couple of decades, Star Wars storytelling has definitely done things like, try to make female characters more prominent, say, within the Empire, for example, when the
Right.
Empire previously in the original trilogy era was certainly presented as very much white male, patriarchal, xenophobic kind of organization. But leaving those integrations aside, we encounter in the original trilogy, that very stereotypical kind of systemic xenophobia and misogyny in the Empire. And then we have Princess Leia as the heroine of A New Hope fighting against it. But I don't think George Lucas necessarily set out to create that kind of heroine, and yet somehow it seems like he did. So I want you to tell me all about Princess Leia and
Right.
how the heroine's labyrinth applies to her.
Okay, so a lot of these archetypal designs are done subconsciously by writers. That
Mm,
is why the hero's journey, for example, the specific designs can be traced. Tolkien did it, Lucas did it, the Iliad and the Odyssey did it. These authors weren't communicating. They're not like, they didn't come up with this plan to coordinate these archetypal designs. Something is spawning independently from the human psyche these patterns. And
the
the
collective
reason I think
unconsciousness, or the collective consciousness, I guess.
I do think yeah, to me, sometimes I'm like,
Hmm.
this is the closest thing to psychic ability that there is, because you have a form of communication through stories that span culture, that transcend culture and span different times. So we're communicating something about the human experience by these repetitive designs. And I do believe it's because the warrior role or the hunter warrior role is something that has perpetuated itself through time. You need people to be willing to defend the culture and the cultural values. Otherwise, you lose the culture. So this need for that warrior role, I think, has created a set of patterns that repeat. I think that's
Mm,
generally where that comes from.
okay.
So the heroine's labyrinth repeats what I believe are another set of shared experiences that can transcend culture and span different times. So the main rub I mentioned was the labyrinth itself, which I believe is a metaphor for socio-cultural challenges, kind of a fixed set of cultural rules and expectations that the lead character must now navigate. And it is a journey. It's a journey of many miles, but one that doesn't stray far from the center. And I think that that's very important, because leaving home is, from an archetypal experienced standpoint, very different set of trauma and very different set of conflicts than staying within the native culture and having people you trust or are supposed to trust in conflict with you. Very, very different internally how that's experienced.
Hmm.
So that's what the labyrinth represents. Secondly, the villain of the heroine's labyrinth is fundamentally different from the archetypal distant dragon of the hero's journey. The
Hmm.
distant dragon is something that is approaching, that you must go out and confront and slay that dragon. The villain of the heroine's labyrinth is called the masked minotaur, and it's a fundamentally different type of villain. These are homegrown villains. These are members of your own native culture that have a duplicity like the minotaur itself. Like the minotaur is half man, half animal, and it's a cursed creature, right? So the outer human self is the disguise. They're usually social apex characters, these villains. Villains that have wield social power,
Hmm.
and they also hide a tyrannical, animalistic side. So they're usually this double being, side by side, and it's not the emperor who's out in the open. Usually it is, or Sauron or Thanos.
Hmm.
These are militant outsiders that are out in the open that are just saying, come at me, bro. I'm
Hmm.
right here. If you want me, you got to take me down. And the hero might attempt single combat. Heroines don't always have to exhibit single combat to take down the masked minotaur villain of their story. The issue is that the masked minotaur is a tyrannical individual who's a member of the native culture, and the heroine can't easily confront the heroine must unmask this individual in order to demonstrate the danger of this individual to her native culture. So,
Mm.
and secondly, the masked minotaur of a totally fascinating aspect is trying to capture the heroine. Not just the heroine, but something I call the sacred fire of the heroine, which is what she cares about most. The masked minotaur attempts to take the sacred fire from the heroine. So that's your basic conflict dynamic in a heroine-centric story. You've got the heroine who claims her sacred fire, her aspirations, her what she cares about, her cause, and then you've got the native culture, which is in conflict with the heroine, and then you've got the masked minotaur, which wants to capture that sacred fire and what I call possessive love to possess the heroine. That is your basic conflict triangle in a heroine-centric story. And then the second, I'll explain how this plays out for Princess Leia in a perfect way.
So I'm hearing this, and of course I've read I've read the book, so I have a bit of a preview of how that works. But in thinking about Princess Leia and the Sacred Fire, that would be, on the one hand, the physical manifestation of that, I imagine, is the plans for the Death Star. But
Correct.
in actual, I guess the broader conceptual idea of it is really the idea of bringing back hope and peace and justice and democracy to the galaxy and getting rid of this autocratic, tyrannical empire that has subjugated the galaxy for, at this point, nearly 2 decades.
Right. So that's the rearrangement. At a very high level, the rearrangement of the labyrinth of the native culture. At the highest level is social a total overturning of the social order, total revolution. That's the ultimate rearrangement. But you can also have, in stories like Jane Eyre or A Scarlet Letter, you can get a smaller rearrangement of the society or a demonstration that society needs to change. The Scarlet Letter was asking society to revisit its views of how it's treating maybe a woman who was pregnant out of wedlock, for example. That was a fixed part of the labyrinth. That is a social norm. And if you break this, you are stigmatized, right? And that's what the Scarlet Letter represents. The stigma, the danger that the native culture presents to the heroine, that if you don't do what is expected, you will be outcast or stigmatized and remain in the native culture. Something that's not the same as the hero departing. Just fundamentally different. So real quick, I'll cover the 3 acts so that I can show you how brilliant A New Hope is and how to look at it with completely new eyes, even though A New Hope is famously a hero's journey story.
Yeah.
And Star Wars is famously a hero's journey, and it is. But there's this second frequency, the heroine's frequency, that we need to tune into. And when you do, it elevates the story even beyond what I already loved about it.
Yeah.
So you have the labyrinth, you have the masked minotaur, you have the heroine's sacred fire. That is how a great story with a heroine usually begins. The heroine claims her sacred fire, which activates the native culture to move in and block that claim, and it activates the masked minotaur, who now wants that from the heroine, wants to possess the heroine and capture her sacred fire. That's your setup. There's the call to adventure, which is no different. Well, it is different, but it's a similar narrative device. You get the ball rolling. However, in the hero's journey, heroes tend to do something called refuse the call. They balk. Luke famously balks. You must come with me to Anchorhead, or you must learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi. And Luke's like, who is pining for adventure? He's staring off at the sunsets. He wants adventure. Now here it is. Here's the call to adventure. You must come with me to Alderaan. And Luke's like, I can't get involved.
Leave.
I got to work. I'm a farmer. This is beyond my pay scale. So he famously refuses the call to adventure, and this is common. Neo does it in The Matrix. He opens the car door. He's about to leave. He's like, fine. But the hero usually changes his mind. In hero-centric stories, when the call to adventure comes, I've noticed that heroines tend to skip the refusal of the call. And I think it's because of the nature of their conflict. If home is the problem, if home is where confinement is felt the most, then when the call to adventure comes within the native culture, the heroine's very eager to accept that call. And secondly, because I don't think the heroine's labyrinth is a warrior hunter arc, I think the answering the call is less likely to mean the heroine's death. Not inevitably, it's less likely. So that means the hero, the hunter warrior who departs, the second he answers that call, he is risking his life. He's risking annihilation. And so the hero better think twice before answering that call. But I think with heroines, it's just fundamentally different. I don't think they're risking their life to answer the call to the same extent. So I think there's less of a reason to balk, more of an opportunity to get out. So that's the call to adventure. Heroines experience an inward journey within the native culture, what I call inner chambers, and of which there are chamber guardians. These are members of the native culture who are more like administrative tricksters who prevent an exchange of information and therefore the heroine's knowledge base growing. They obstruct the heroine's trying to learn about the native culture. And then there are heroic partners in hero-centric stories, one of which is the beast as ally, which is usually a character who's non-conforming to the native culture. Why the heroine is interested in this individual. As off-putting as the beast as ally might be because of the non-conformist behavior, at least the beast as ally is exactly who he seems to be. So there's an unexpected source of authenticity that the heroine truly values in this individual. Secondly, there is a second heroic partner. It's called the fragile power. This is usually a small or childlike individual that is overlooked or even considered burdensome to other heroic partners. And however, the fragile power is entrusted by the heroine and often rises to a great moment in the story's climax. We saw this with Newt in Aliens. The heroine entrusted her fragile power, which was Newt. And in the beginning, she's looked at as, dead weight. And, by the end of the story, she's leading the battle-hardened Marines out of the labyrinth of the colony through the ventilation shaft. She's leading them, and they're following her. So that's the fragile power. Then there's a broken truce. This is another archetypal design in which the heroine openly defies her native culture. The native culture moves in aggressively to curb the heroine's claim. And so there's the symbol I always put is a police car, because you will see the law enforcement or the law enforcement arm of the native culture move in to curb the heroine, or the villagers grab their pitchforks. Either way, the native culture turns against the heroine with the broken truce. There's a poisoned apple, in which the Minotaur tries to extract the sacred fire of the heroine through a deliberate mean. The poisoned apple, it's usually something injected, something internal. That's the key. It's something internal that alters the heroine's state so that the masked Minotaur can try to take her or possess her sacred fire. There's an unmasking of the Minotaur. There's a battle that takes place on home turf. Home is battleground. And then ultimately, there is a broken spell in which the native culture, the deception of the masked Minotaur is broken, and the native culture rearranges. That is essentially the path of the heroine's labyrinth. A New Hope, unbelievably, has a massive dose of the middle section of the heroine's labyrinth embedded in the story. And it's unbelievable, because now that I've seen it, A New Hope is more of Leia's story than I ever imagined. Now,
yeah, as you're talking about it, like dominoes are falling for in this whole thing.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. You can almost make the case that A New Hope is Leia's story, that Empire Strikes Back is Luke's story, and The Return of the Jedi is Vader's story. You can almost make that case. So the movie Star Wars: A New Hope has one of the most famous openings in all of cinematic history. We all know, you can just close your eyes and that scene is there. It's waiting for you.
Right.
That's a broken truce by Princess Leia. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the heroine-centric story arc. The broken truce, where the heroine turns against her native culture out in the open, and the native culture does not accept this, and they come after her. So you literally see in the opening scene of Star Wars: A New Hope, a heroine at a heroine's flight from her native culture, and the native culture bearing down after her. I even joked that the Star Destroyer has a head and horns almost just like a masked Minotaur. So it even has a visual cue that this is the masked Minotaur coming after you. So let me and even for the listeners, is Darth Vader Luke's villain in A New Hope?
No, he's not. I mean,
they
I'm joking for the listeners. Yeah, he's not.
Yeah, Vader has nothing to do with Luke except the most indirect through the most indirect means through the entire film. The entire film.
Right.
Vader
Luke
burns down
doesn't
the
even
home.
know about Darth Vader until, the concept of him is introduced by Obi-Wan. And then he's just this, boogeyman kind of figure, basically, as far as Luke is concerned, until then, they're chasing each other in the Death Star battle.
Oh, 100%. So
Yeah.
now Vader does burn down Luke's homestead, but that's
Hmm.
that's incidental. He doesn't know Luke. He doesn't care. This is just stormtroopers, and it's not even Vader. It's the stormtroopers that did it.
Right.
You could tell by the blast points that those were Imperial troopers.
So far removed. Yeah, so far removed from that.
Right. So and Vader barely doesn't even know Luke. He brushes in. He brushes up against Luke in the trenches at the end. Recognizes that the Force is strong with him, and then doesn't even get a shot off. Han Solo comes in, right?
Hmm.
Through the entire story of A New Hope, Darth Vader, the greatest villain in cinematic history, is only dealing with Princess Leia throughout the entire film. Vader and Leia, Leia and Vader. That's what Vader's about in A New Hope. So here's the broken truce. You have Princess Leia escaping. Vader himself is coming after her. What represents Princess Leia's sacred fire? The Death Star plans. What she cares about most, her character, is the rebellion against the Empire. That's what Princess Leia cares about. And she's
Hmm.
carrying a symbol of that cause, which is the Death Star plans. So you have the masked Minotaur moving in as a social apex character of the native culture, and he's trying to capture those Death Star plans. He wants that from the heroine. Classic problem for the heroine, that the Minotaur wants this from her. What does Princess Leia do? Does she stand in? She does. Her troops stand and fight. What does she do? She does something that I believe, the more I think about it, is incredibly counterintuitive. She trusts a droid with the Death Star plans. These are the trillions of lives are at stake, and she
Hmm.
gives them to R2D2 out of her hands. Now, by the way, this is not uncommon for heroines to trust in randomness or chance at times.
Mm.
So, but R2D2 represents the fragile power, just like
Yes.
Newt in Aliens, just like Meriadoc in Lord of the Rings with Lady Éowyn. There's the fragile power that the heroine entrusts, and this small childlike character, which is what the fragile power is, takes this mission by his heroine very seriously, doesn't he?
Hmm. Oh, absolutely.
So Leia's got the sacred fire of the rebellion in her hand to open, and she's racing away from the native culture with this torch in her hand. Vader's coming in to get it. She hands the torch off to the fragile power, and R2D2's out. He's gone. She entrusted the fragile power. Now the fragile power goes on this mission. So what's Luke Skywalker doesn't even show up in A New Hope until the 17th minute, which is very counterintuitive if we're
Hmm.
thinking of Star Wars as just Luke's story.
Right.
And my case is that it's not really Luke's story, it's Princess Leia's story. And so for the first 17 minutes, we're following her conflicts. She's the one who cares about the rebellion. Luke doesn't care. Han certainly doesn't care. He even says, I'm not in this for your revolution.
Hmm.
No one cares. Only Princess Leia cares. And she's captured. Another common, it's called a captivity bargain in the heroine's labyrinth. And Leia is brought into the Death Star, where she's imprisoned. Um, and it's and the Death Star is a labyrinth, by the way. It's
Hmm.
very easy to spot the labyrinthine imagery inside the Death Star. So the fragile power brings the Death Star plans to Luke. Luke uncovers this pre-existing relationship between veterans of the Clone Wars and this old Jedi Order, and Luke's call to adventure comes, and he ends up taking it.
Hmm.
You have the hero, so you have the fragile power with R2, but you now also have the Beast as ally, which I would argue is Han Solo.
Right.
He's a
Hmm.
non-conforming character, meaning he's at odds with the native culture
Hmm.
himself. Just like the heroine, he's a smuggler. The Imperials will get him. There's a bounty on his head. That's why heroines are interested in the Beast as ally, the Beast archetype, which Han Solo absolutely is. And Han Solo, he outmans Luke throughout the whole film. He talks down to him. He's bigger than him. He's more physical than him. He's good in a fight. He's arguing with Princess Leia. And so anyway, you've got the heroic partners, and you even have a poisoned apple. So when I mentioned the poisoned apple archetype, a lot of people immediately think of Snow White,
Hmm.
right? We
Right.
think of
Yeah.
Eve from the Bible.
Hmm.
Those are the obvious ones. But a poisoned apple has certain archetypal patterns to it that are specific and go beyond um, just an apple. So let me pull that up real quick so I can think of
I'm sitting here just like bouncing up and down in my chair going, I know what it is. I know what it is.
it. Yeah, totally. So here's the archetype of a poisoned apple, usually delivered by the masked minotaur of the story.
Hmm.
Okay. So in Aliens, the poisoned apple is the face hugger, by the way, just to give you one example.
Hmm.
Delivered by Burke. He's the disguised villain in Aliens. Delivered
Right.
by the masked, delivered through premeditation and in bad faith,
Hmm.
often disguised. Knocks out, disorients, or disables the heroine. That's what the poisoned apple's part of its purpose to do. Not usually to kill her, but to
Hmm.
knock her out and disorient her or disable her. The poison is something internal, ingested, injected, implanted, embedded. Usually includes a restrained, unconscious, or debilitated heroine.
Hmm.
Often depicts a menacing figure like the masked minotaur hovering nearby in terms of imagery. It depicts,
Hmm.
you see the minotaur hovering over the heroine all the time during this
Okay. Yeah.
movie.
Yep.
Um, the minotaur often attempts to extract, steal, diminish, or destroy the heroine's sacred fire. So in this situation, she's captive, typical of the captivity bargain, and Vader is the masked minotaur to Princess Leia.
Hmm.
That mind probe comes in,
Yep.
right? It's
Yep.
got a syringe. It's got the needle. The needle, by the way, is one of the most recurring symbols of the poisoned apple because it's
Hmm.
something delivered internally.
Yep.
Um, like the face hugger, there's something delivered internally.
Hmm.
So even Vader is menacing Princess Leia with his poisoned apple. And what is he trying to do? He even says it'll take some time to extract the information from her. He is trying to take her sacred fire physically
Hmm.
without her consent. He's trying to take this from her.
Right.
So you've got even the poisoned apple that you think of with Snow White still happening with Princess Leia.
Hmm.
Now, here come heroic partners, and this is common. So the hero's journey intersects with the heroine's labyrinth, right? Luke
Hmm.
goes on this quest with Han and the Millennium Falcon. Luke comes sweeping into her situation. The door pops up. I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you. And Leia's not very impressed. She's not. She doesn't show any sense of urgency at first. She just decides to knock on him for a second. Anyway, but she is rescued from her cell by Luke Skywalker. And I'd like to point out, and Han Solo. And I'd like to point out that the Beast's ally in the Heroine's Labyrinth is the feminine view, at least in the feminine story structure, of the knight in shining armor. So the hero sees himself as a knight in shining armor. But
Mm.
to the heroine, he's the same character is called the Beast as ally. And this character often comes across to the heroine as just as off-putting, just as unlikable as the masked minotaur.
Mm.
And there's usually a doppelganger effect between the beast as ally of the heroine and the masked minotaur, that they're both they both exhibit this half man, half animal expression.
Hmm.
In the masked minotaur, it's the animal self that's dominant, the tyrannical animal self. And in the beast as ally, it's his humanity that ends up being dominant. And we have that at play with Leia and Han. They do not get
Interesting.
along.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, they're famously at odds with each other. So now think about this. One of the things about the Beast as ally is that the Beast as ally often adopts the heroine's cause.
Mm.
This
Okay.
is very important. Uh,
Hmm.
the Beast adopts the heroine's cause, which is an amazing thing because he's supposed to be such an off-putting individual. The heroine usually has the ability to build bridges where they weren't existing before as part of
Hmm.
this archetype. So the
Right.
Beast as ally often exhibits antisocial or nonconformist attitude toward the native culture.
Hmm.
Han Solo clearly does that. The Beast is usually protective of the heroine. I would argue Han still maintains that. Um, the Beast rejects possessive love. Now, Han doesn't officially do this till the end of Return of the Jedi,
Hmm.
He's like, when Luke comes back, I won't get
I
in the
won't get
way.
in the way. Yeah.
He's respecting her own free will and decision to choose for herself. That's a mark of the Beast as ally. Um, the Beast is also drawn to the heroine sacred fire. The Beast almost always adopts the heroine's cause. So what's interesting is by the end of the movie, when you hear Yahoo, you're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
Hmm.
You have two characters who could care less about the events of the world and the Empire now at the forefront of the rebellion, right up against it. And both Han and Luke adopt Leia's cause. So she has brought these two characters into the rebellion, and now they just destroyed the Death Star. And R2D2 is there to take the plans, and R2D2 is there in the trenches. So the heroine saved the day. Even though she might feel inactive on Yavin,
Hmm.
it is her actions that led to the destruction of the Death Star unequivocally. Unequivocally, we can lay that accolade at the feet of Princess Leia.
Yeah, that does bring to mind a couple of interesting points. The fact that, in thinking about the story, one of the things that happens on Yavin, Luke and Han get into an argument about the money and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is that that argument actually starts earlier as our heroes are on their way to Yavin, and or not Luke, Han and Leia are having this discussion about their, about his his interest in just getting rewarded for what he's doing, and not being committed to the cause. Like, that conversation's already happening, and she started it, and then Luke is kind of carrying it on because he's been adopted into the cause. And then the other thing
Yeah.
that occurs too is the idea of Han going. I think a lot of us have looked at this as like Han showing up to rescue Luke, and the way you put it, I mean, that is kind of true, but it is also, as you said, it is Han fully deciding to adopt the rebel cause, which is really Leia's cause
Leia's
ultimately.
cause,
And he's going to
unequivocally.
help that. Yeah. So then do you see it as possible then for, I mean, I think I know what the answer to this is, but
Okay.
that the hero's journey and the heroine's labyrinth, like these stories or these story structures can actually coexist and integrate in with each other in service of one larger story then.
Yes, in fact, I see that these two monomyths work together quite often. In fact, the
Mm.
more I study it, the more I can see one alive on one side and the other alive on the other. But they absolutely, a lot of stories, in fact, will actually, let's say a male-centric story. A lot of times it's we're following the Beast as ally, who comes in and adopts a heroine's cause. So when the Beast comes in to rescue the princess, I know this. Sometimes this is viewed negatively,
Mm.
and I understand why it's viewed negatively. There's a line of thought that says, a hero rescuing a heroine takes away the heroine's agency. That
Hmm.
could be true, and you certainly do not want the message that a heroine needs to wait for something external to solve her problems. You do not want that message. The heroine's labyrinth has proven to me that this is not the case, that heroines must solve the problem and conflict with their native culture. It's essential for the arc of the story, for the
Hmm.
heroine. The conflict with their native culture must get resolved at the end. She must reconcile this. So they absolutely coexist. My issue, or my new perspective on this, is that some stories that may have been reductive in the past, I can view with a different level of thinking and appreciation. For example, Clash of the Titans, the
Hmm.
old one from the 80s. You've got, Andromeda chained to the mountain, and you got the Kraken menacing the native culture, and then Perseus sweeps in to slay the Kraken. I used to view that negatively, like, Andromeda has no agency in the scene. She's just completely passive and waiting for the hero to do all the work. That's only true if we follow the hero's story.
Mm.
Uh, so, you know, if we take seriously what's going on with Andromeda, she's chained to a mountain. Her native culture has turned against her. This is a huge crisis for Andromeda. You know, the fact that a hero sweeps in to assist her is certainly an interesting development for her. but it does not solve her underlying problem with her native culture. Who chained her there? Who are those people? Her
Hmm.
parents? That's not good. She's gonna have to go back to those people if Perseus breaks those chains for her. Her problems have not been solved, and we can see that she's in the worst form of a captivity bargain possible when we see her chained to that mountain. So now I see an untold story with Andromeda,
There, yeah. Hmm.
not so much a passive maiden. We just see her in this moment where she can't do much. And so that's why we want to reject that. I'm simply suggesting if you care about Andromeda's, if you care about the rest of her story, I guarantee you there's more to it, and she has to solve the problem with her native culture herself.
Ah, okay. All right. And so we're really only getting like a small window of the actual like of the full story
A
in the sense.
snapshot.
Yes. Hmm.
Right. Leia's a captive princess in this. It's something that we would like to reject. We want to not like that for good reason. Like there's a good reason why we question the captive princess.
Hmm.
If there's a good reason to fight for the positive portrayal of a heroine with agency. These are absolutes. I'm simply suggesting that in some of the older stories, we're only seeing a snapshot of the heroine.
Hmm.
So when we say "and they lived happily ever after," that's the egregious error because we've skipped the rest of the heroine story.
Got it. And so, thinking of other stories too, I mean, A New Hope it has obviously been the gold standard in thinking about the hero's journey, and
Yeah,
it sounds like the heroine's labyrinth as well. But I know you are versed in other Star Wars storytelling. We talked about it at the beginning with the prequels, and of course now we have the sequels as well. Do you see the heroine's labyrinth playing out in the stories of, say, Padme or Rey?
I do. So one of the expanded variants of the Beast is Ally. Because if you break down the archetype, there's why are heroines and beasts matching up, archetypally speaking? Because heroines have an ability, I call it xenopathy, the ability to communicate or understand, and this goes beyond sympathy or empathy. This is why I
Mm,
gave it a new name.
mm,
To find the language necessary to build a bridge between herself and someone else that is completely unlike herself.
mm,
And the heroine builds this bridge. Beauty and the Beast, Belle
hmm.
and the Beast. These two are at complete odds with each other. He was just as bad as the masked Minotaur, who's Gaston in the story. He
Right.
locks her up too. She found the language to build that bridge, and she changed the whole circumstance of the labyrinth, and the Beast adopts her cause at the end.
Hmm.
He
Yep.
surrenders his claim to her. So, but Gaston does not. That's the
The.
fundamental difference between the Minotaur and the Beast.
Hmm.
So, in Star Wars, it has a hero's journey story to it. It has a very abbreviated hero's journey story in A New Hope. Luke goes out and slays the dragon, which is the Death Star. Leia is in the clutches of Act Two of the heroine's labyrinth. She's broken her truce because remember, Leia's a member of the native culture.
Hmm.
She's
Yes.
a member of the government. This is not just her breaking away because she likes her plan. She's involved with the Empire. So this is
Hmm.
not a small thing for her to steal plans and make a break for it.
Right.
Um, so secondly, home as battleground is a big factor for heroines too. So a lot of times their conflicts take place at home. So and also there's an archetypal design called the Black Swan in heroine-centric stories, which is the massive destabilization of their native culture from a chaotic event, often natural disaster. There's a lot of
Mm.
association with heroines and natural disaster. I have an entire chapter of it, whether it's Coraline, whose world is falling apart at the end, or Scarlett O'Hara while Atlanta's burning to the ground. Um, or Janie Crawford in Their Eyes Were Watching God as a Florida hurricane sweeps over, or Dorothy Gale with the tornado coming in.
Hmm.
This upturning of the native culture is the Black Swan. Now, think about it. With the Death Star, we heard that it can destroy planets, but we only see it destroy one planet in the entire trilogy.
Hmm.
Whose planet do we see destroyed?
Yeah.
It's
Princess
Princess
Leia's.
Leia's planet. That's her home. It's
Hmm.
not Tatooine. It's not Luke's home. It's not Corellia. It's not Han's home. It's Princess Leia. So the one apocalyptic image we get is intimate to Princess Leia. That's her home. That's the
Hmm.
only time we see her very tough veneer crack when she says no and she rushes forward, in a futile attempt to stop the destruction of her home planet. So here again, we're in Leia's story. The Death Star destroyed her home world. So we have that there too. So anyway, what I wanted to point out, after A New Hope is where Leia starts to get lost in the story, and it really shifts toward Luke's hero's journey and atonement with his father.
Hmm.
So, if you want to criticize Lucas for Leia's reductive role, I would say Empire and Jedi. There's, I think, a better case there. Um, However, there's A New Hope, I think, is Leia's story. Now, that
Hmm.
said, although the OT has this hero's journey, famous hero's journey attribute, I think the prequels are a heroine's labyrinth story, and Anakin Skywalker is structurally the heroine. His
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
because he is in his native culture. The
Hmm.
villain is homegrown and disguised. Palpatine
Hmm.
is a masked minotaur. He's a
Hmm.
social apex character who is outwardly benevolent and has the human face, but he's secretly tyrannical. He's a Sith Lord.
Hmm.
Um, so you've got this dynamic where Anakin and where does Anakin's conflicts come from? The rules and expectations of his native culture. You cannot
Hmm.
have attachments. You
Hmm.
cannot marry Padme. These are the walls that block him in of the labyrinth that mean everything.
Hmm.
Secondly, if we shift a little bit to Padme, she is another what I call female ambassador, which is part of the Beast as arch. So Beast as ally, I said, has this where the heroine has the ability to build bridges.
Hmm.
That's where this comes from. So you see it in the Beauty and the Beast motif. But if you expand beyond that, you have something that I call the bridal ambassador, in which there's a lot of heroines. Game of Thrones has a lot of these that they're married to a foreign culture and they become a bridal ambassador. They begin to build a bridge between two other cultures that matter. Game of Thrones has a whole bunch. Jon Snow and Ygritte. Those are two rival cultures, but through the heroine, through Ygritte, they build that bridge, and there's an alliance between the Night's Watch and the Wildlings.
Hmm.
You get the same thing with Catelyn Stark and Rob. They're all married into foreign culture. The expansion beyond that of the bridal ambassador, this ability to build bridges, is what I call the female diplomat. I think Leia qualifies as a female diplomat, and Padme Amidala is unequivocally a female diplomat.
Hmm.
So that is her role, one of her major roles in the film. So the prequels actually follows a lot of the heroine's labyrinth motifs, whereas the original trilogy is much more hero's journey,
Hmm.
except for A New Hope. A New Hope, I think, is I hope it gets fresh analysis, and I hope Leia gets her due because it's more excitingly a heroine's labyrinth story than it was a hero's journey story. Not that that's not there; it still counts.
Hmm.
But think about the training sequence and the wise mentor of A New Hope. The only training we get is Luke in the remote probe.
Hmm.
That's pretty quick. That's a pretty quick scene.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we expand on it in Empire Strikes Back to a great degree, but in A New Hope, the training sequence is minimal. you know.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, as you talk about this and as you were talking about the prequel trilogy, the idea that you could break down the OT by saying A New Hope is Leia's story and Empire is Luke's story and Return of the Jedi is Vader's story. It made me think that in a way, looking at the prequel trilogy, I'm really fascinated by the idea of the heroine's labyrinth idea with Anakin as the heroine, as it were, or in
Structurally,
that
yeah,
that feminine structurally. But I feel like the Phantom Menace really feels like Padme's story specifically in a way
totally.
because she is the one, like when you talk about home as battleground, I mean, Naboo becomes the literal battleground for the whole thing. And for somebody to be building bridges between cultures, like the Beast is ally, that's Jar Jar Binks in a way, like, and then
Yeah,
by extension, Boss Nass being able to build those bridges. And then, also, I guess, with Qui-Gon as a natural ally, but also with Obi-Wan, who is initially not really on board with all of this. And Obi-Wan
totally.
exhibits a lot of a lot kind of a lot of Beast as ally traits in a way when Anakin gets on board, like, oh, we've brought on another
Useless
another
life form.
useless life form, exactly like Jar Jar. And it made me even think about the fact that early drafts of the Phantom Menace actually had Padme and Obi-Wan as potential love interests as well, which would also fit the Beast
Oh,
as ally
wow.
kind of thing. We've been talking about the Phantom Menace a little bit this year on the podcast because it's the 25th anniversary this
Yeah,
year, and also I got to be on a podcast talking about it, podcast Stardust, which is very cool. But
so
like,
cool.
so the idea that then the prequel trilogy could be broken up the same way, that the Phantom Menace is potentially like Padme's story, and I can see a situation where Anakin is both the headliner for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. But
Yeah. Yep.
yeah, because it doesn't, I very much want to figure out who it is if it's not Anakin in one of those two other movies, just to kind of like find the similar pattern with the original trilogy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you might be able to make the case that a Phantom Menace is Padme's story. I think there's actually a very clear case there. Attack of the Clones is much more of Obi-Wan's story, and Revenge of the Sith is Anakin's story. So
Yeah.
I think you can see a shift in focus. It's Obi-Wan that goes to Camino. Um, Obi-Wan is driving a lot of the action in Attack of the Clones. So.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a way to break that down in a similar fashion where the first story in both the prequels and the OT is really heroine centric.
Hmm.
Um, the home is battleground is, variant phrases I use are home invasion or invasion of the inner sanctum. And Naboo is absolutely that. I mean, there's, almost iconic imagery of the battle droids coming in, almost like the Nazis into Paris,
Hmm.
under the arch in Naboo. So you have some of those same motifs right there.
And in a similar fashion, you have Obi-Wan getting captured on Geonosis, and it's his cause where he's the one who's investigating what exactly is happening with the Separatists and this plot that he's uncovering. So it's really like his cause that's been established. And even though he's captured and is then being rescued, initially with the rescue attempt that fails by Anakin and Padme, but then with all the Jedi
Right.
showing up, it is actually that all of these Jedi and all these other people, they are rallying to Obi-Wan's cause in that
Totally.
particular case.
100%. In fact, one of the archetypal designs that I didn't even get into is called the Cult of Deception. Because the heroine is in her native culture and has conflicts there, there's almost always what I call a cult of deception, which is there's an agenda at work that the heroine is unaware of at first, but is running into evidence of this as the heroine is redirected or misdirected within the native culture. So, like for Aliens and an Alien, the heroine has Wayland Yutani. There is a massive cult of deception. There's another agenda at work there. And then in the prequels, you absolutely have a cult of deception. It's called the Phantom Menace. I mean, the title, you can
Mhm.
argue, is the title of the cult of deception. And also think about this: the masked Minotaur of the prequels, which is Palpatine. Whose homeworld does he come from?
From Naboo, yeah. Hmm.
Padme's. It's Padme. She knows him intimately. He is deceiving her directly, most directly, as a member of Naboo. So it's just fascinating to me to find these common traits, these archetypal designs repeating, and they're right there in Star Wars, which I think we've always thought of as purely hero's journey. Now there's this, like I said, a second frequency that you could pick up on and be like, oh my God, if you focus on Leia, all these other things are going on. And my latest belief is that one of the reasons A New Hope has succeeded at the level it has is because we are responding to both sets of archetypes simultaneously. We're simultaneously the hero entrapped in the labyrinth and the hero setting out to slay the dragon. We're both in this heroic team of characters. So little note to Hollywood: if you could figure out how to balance those two, you might have lightning in a bottle.
Yeah. Oh gosh. It's not like I need an excuse to watch a Star Wars movie, but I gotta tell you, Like, I'm thrilled for my next viewing because like the awareness of this second frequency now is going to change my perspective on things. I'm really looking forward to it, and so I'm incredibly grateful for this conversation, and I want our listeners to be able to learn more about it on their own time as well. So Doug, where can people keep up with you and what you're doing and learn more about the Heroine's Labyrinth? Like, where should they go to look out for you?
Well, I would actually recommend checking out the website,
Mhm.
douglasaburton.com. The reason I like to direct people there is because I made a video that discusses the first archetypal design, which is the labyrinth itself. And there is like 80 different images of movies spliced in there. So I bring it all. I try to bring it all in terms of examples so that you understand how the labyrinth works, both metaphorically and physically in stories. From Wizard of Oz, or as Kirkus Review says, from the Bible to Barbie, because I do analyze Barbie as well, which starts as a hero's journey and ends as a heroine's labyrinth, like emphatically. So anyway, my website has this great video that I'm very proud of because I think I make my point. So you can check that out. You can also find me and follow me on Twitter. I also make appearances on YouTube. Right now, I'm on the Table Talk channel and also Retro Nerd Girl. We will talk about movies, and sometimes we will discuss a film or a story in terms of the Heroine's Labyrinth. It's a small group of us that are familiar with all the terms and have really internalized the concept, so it can be real fun to analyze a new film. We did Terminator, which is heroine-centric, Wizard of Oz. It's fun. It's fun to look at these stories.
That is awesome. And I will make sure to put these links in the show notes for everybody to check out. Awesome. I've taken up so much of your time. I'm so grateful for all of it. Doug Burton, thank you so much for making the time to talk about this. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate it too. It's so fun. If you love Star Wars, then this is an easy thing to love because it really gives you a new lens to look at these stories with. And I think makes it more enjoyable,
100% agree. 100% agree.
So yeah, the last thing I'll say is if you are a writer and you are interested in tapping in or harnessing the Heroine's Labyrinth to help you with your story, the way it helped me with mine, you can get a copy. There is a book. It's called The Heroine's Labyrinth, Archetypal Designs in Heroine-Led Fiction, where I really get into the nitty-gritty with these archetypal designs. I have over 300 examples or 250 examples in there. So it's loaded with stuff that anyone can follow. And it's writer to writer. It's me telling you what I came up with to help my story. Maybe it can help you with yours.
And I will link to that in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
Doug, thank you again so much.
You got it. Thanks for having me on.
And there you go. That's my conversation with Doug Burton, author of, among other things, The Heroine's Labyrinth, and that is going to do it for this bonus episode of the podcast. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast, as always, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyrighted by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.